So the other day, we were having this debate of whether or not a book was a fantasy book or
I
not.
took down all the books from my bookshelf and decided I was going to put them all back up. And when I did, I was like, I'm just going to put these where I think they belong. And he totally disagreed with some of my books.
I did.
So here we are to duke it out.
You see, so what we do, or what we have, I guess, is we've got 3 books each, and we're going to debate whether or not they're fantasy or, I about said romantasy. Check out our romantasy video. No, a fantasy or not fantasy.
Yeah, just fiction.
Now, the interesting thing with fantasy is I think there is an option, if you will, to take anything that is fictional with a little bit of fantastical elements to it, whimsical elements to it, maybe anything like that, and put it into fantasy. But I think there's also maybe a stricter definition of fantasy that is more maybe Dungeons and Dragons style, right? If you can think in that vein. And so it is interesting that there's obviously this range of, we decide it's fantasy or not. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of these and try and decide for ourselves, is this fantasy or not?
Yep.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first.
All right.
This is The Midnight Library. It's a fantastic book. There is some time travel in here. It's time travel, but it's not time travel because it's her life, but it's a different part of her life. Like she opens up a book and it takes her to a different life depending on what decision she made.
So here's my thing. She's basically having a dream. Right?
Not really. She's like nearly dead and having this like
dream.
Reliving her life.
She's unconscious. She's having a dream, basically.
Okay.
Right? Does any book that has a dream state where they're doing some dream qualify as fantasy? Like, because the setting isn't fantastical. It's not like they're on another world or there's magic or any of those type of things. They just are, she's just imagining things in this near-death experience.
No, she's in this midnight library with all these books.
I mean, yes, that is the setting of this dream that she's having. But I mean, there's lots of dreams that happen. I'm not sure if that makes any time there's a dream setting that it's a fantasy book.
Yeah, it's a debate. I think it definitely falls more under fiction, but that like a little bit has me questioning sometimes.
There is this interesting grouping that they call like philosophical fiction, where it's often where someone's trying to either like teach something or make you think about something. And I think Midnight Library probably falls into that, right? Where it's using more of like a parable almost or something like that to try and get you to think about your own life and some of the things that might or might not happen based off your decisions. And so I think that's probably more where I would put it, not necessarily in fantasy. But I guess I can see your debate, but I think this one maybe carries less water than some other ones.
I agree, but still, it just has me wondering sometimes.
All right. Speaking of wondering, so I'm curious about these type of books. Right?
Yeah.
So this is so I don't know much about this book. I haven't read it, right? But here's what I gather from understanding. This is a person taken off the street and dropped into luxury to compete for someone's heart.
It's like you read the back of the book.
Yeah, or in my head, I always equated this to The Bachelor.
Yes, that is essentially The Bachelor.
So I'm sure that this could be in a different country, could be in a different world, even like a fake world, but it still feels to me like it's not actually fantasy, but more just fiction.
Like dystopian?
Dystopian, sure. I mean, but dystopian, I don't necessarily think it's necessarily fantasy. You can have a dystopian fantasy.
Yeah.
But I think a dystopian world and fantasy, they're different. Even I think you can have magic in a world and still not have fantasy per se.
Definitely.
And be there. So I would judge this as not fantasy.
That one almost feels more like science fiction just because it's... No, it doesn't. That's a bad example.
No, like I think this is a good example of just fiction. Right? Of just young adult fiction.
Interesting. I like want to ask Google about that one. I've not read that book in 15 years.
All right. Okay.
That might not.
What's your next one?
Might not be true. Okay. I've read 2 of her books now. Amy Harmon.
Okay.
This is The Unknown Beloved. And then she also has What the Wind Knows, which easily one of my favorites of the year. I just don't own a copy yet.
Okay.
The character in here what year is it? 1923. When she touches a material like a shirt or a pillow or
I
a shoe
remember you
or
talking about
like
this. She like can see the history
she
of it or
can,
something.
yeah, like she knows where it's been, or she can tell its story because it like has its memories inside of the fabric or the material. And it's really pretty. And same with the other one, What the Wind Knows, very much like an Irish Outlander, where she just plops into this other world. So kind of the same thing with like Midnight Library, where there's that time travel. But then this one, there's not time travel, but there's just this actual like she can hear, smell, taste. I don't remember what the.
So that's an interesting thing. Can anyone else do this type of thing,
No.
or is it just limited to the one person?
Apparently, it's like because her grandpa was some seamstress guy. Like materials always has been different to them.
So my argument would be, because yes, there's fantastical elements, right? But because the entire world isn't fantastical, it's just kind of one special person in it, that it would fall more in fiction. For a few reasons, right? You have a very specific real setting. You just have someone that can do special things inside of that thing, which I think happens a lot of times in fiction. I think of like Sherlock Holmes, right? Very real setting. You just happen to have a genius that can do things.
This is actually very Sherlock Holmesy because she's helping to solve some murders.
Right, but definitely not really fiction or not fantasy. It more sits under maybe like mystery fiction or something like that.
Yeah, this definitely would be go under mystery. I don't know. It just makes me wonder.
So I would argue not fantasy.
Okay.
Personally.
I just think I agree. but it was one where I stuck it not in fantasy or not in fiction. So I did put it in fantasy. But now it's not in fantasy. I don't know. Yeah. I'll probably move it a few more times.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to have one. So I have this one. This is Under the Whispering Door. What I really wanted was House of the Syrian Sea, but it's been loaned out.
Yep.
But similar things. You have a real world with some fantastical elements put on top of it. That is more about teaching, I think, some sort of moral lesson than it is about anything else. And so you kind of have some sort of magic stuff going on, but it's not even really magic. Like the magic isn't really central to it. So this is an interesting one because it really feels like it's kind of on this line.
I imagine because if this is similar to the Cerulean Sea, I've only read Cerulean Sea. I just was left needing and wanting so much more because it didn't dive into those magical things.
Which is why I don't think it's fantasy.
Really?
Yep.
I think it's fantasy.
So and here's my argument, right? Fantasy, I think, is one of those things where the world and the setting really, really matters.
Okay.
Right? I think the stories being told in both the House of the Cerulean Sea and Under the Whispering Door are the setting's almost immaterial. Right? You could change the setting and move it somewhere else or do something else and still tell a lot of the same story.
Yeah.
It's just told a little bit to embellish things, to give it a little more oomph in the storytelling.
Make it stand out.
Yes.
I just think like there's enough going on. It's not like one person or one ability or one tiny thing. Like there's enough of it that it totally counts as fantasy.
So it's definitely closer, I think, in certain regards than other books.
It's accessible fantasy. Like if you didn't read any fantasy and you read this, you'd be like, oh, that's totally fantasy. Like it's easy. It's easy to consume. It's kind of light, but I think it's fantasy.
I don't know. This is where I still lean to this being more like that philosophical fiction.
Crazy.
Or just straight fiction. And I think there needs to be room to be like, this is just a fiction book. Because a fiction book is, by definition, a made-up story.
Yes.
Right? And I think there's a whole host of things that wouldn't be fantasy, but fall into that kind of made-up story. Because fantastical tends to mean it's over the top. There's something kind of extreme about it. Extreme about the world, extreme about the situation, extreme about things. And you get a little bit of that here, but I think more of where it shines is taking a more fantastical element and putting it more down to earth and then bringing somebody in it and teaching lessons about that thing.
Interesting.
And the fantastical portion of it is just enough it just is like a change of scenery, so you don't you're not necessarily directly connecting it
Yeah.
to current life, which makes you not necessarily put up walls, right? Where so, for instance, in House of Cerulean Sea, you have this more fantastical like orphanage where you have some people that have extreme abilities that go to it.
Yes.
I think that allows people to focus more on what's happening and get lulled into the story and then learn kind of the moral, I guess, of the story there
Yes.
than it would be if they said like, look, this is a story about society and about people that have
Like marginalized groups.
marginalized groups. Yeah, instead of having like, hey, we're talking about marginalized people, we're talking about people that have magical abilities.
Yeah.
And so it's a morality tale more than anything. So that's why I think it's not fantasy.
Man, I think there's just too much of it. I think it's like the proportion of it.
I-
It tips so much that way.
I can see the argument there, but I would still classify this as not fantasy, I think, in that regard.
Does this door
But
whisper?
Does the door whisper?
Yeah.
You should read this book.
Okay, I will.
You'd really
It's
like
on
it.
my list. I'll
You know
get
what?
to it.
And it actually reminds me a whole lot of both The Midnight Library and The Book Thief, actually.
Okay.
Very,
Spoiler alert.
very similar. And actually, I think the reason why both of them remind me so much of it is all three of them deal with death.
Sad.
That's a lot of what's happening here.
That's really sad.
Is they're all trying to help people, I think, in different ways cope with very traumatic things.
This one I'm gonna probably put back into fantasy. I don't think I could put it in my fiction section.
Okay.
It just doesn't seem to fit.
All right. We'll wait till you read this one. House of Cerulean Sea, I think, is an interesting debate. I would lean non-fantasy.
Crazy. All right. So speaking of death and the book thief, I have the book thief. Death is the narrator of this book. Like that alone is not. I mean, I think it goes just past fiction.
I don't know if I would agree. First of all, I don't think death is a fantastical thing.
No, but like the fact that he is narrating and giving you all of these foreshadowings, it's pretty like.
Yeah, but I guess the world isn't particularly
No,
fantastical.
The world
right?
is not. Like these are current. Like these are not current.
Right.
These are actual events, like
Yep.
based off history.
So the world isn't fantastical. It's
Nope.
it just is if the argument is just the narrator is fictional or
Like the little
fantastical.
drawing things.
Right, like again, I think it's just a tool being used to share. Like and this really comes down to. So we had a previous video we talked about the difference between fantasy and romantasy, right? If you remove the romance, does the plot still work? That's how I would argue what fantasy is.
Yeah.
And romantasy is when you remove the romance, it falls apart. I think the argument of if it's fantasy or not is if you remove the fantasy, does it still work?
Yeah.
Then I think it's not fantasy.
You're right.
Right.
Well, that's sad.
And so I think the book thief, if you remove the fantastical, if death didn't tell the story, it would still be an interesting story.
It would.
And still be a really good book.
Yeah, might not be as pretty, but
No. Right. But it would be there. And
that's okay. I've
I,
already come to terms with this going back into fiction.
Which is where, interestingly, I would argue also with Under the Listening Door and House of Cerulean Sea. I think if you remove the fantasy, the story would still remain.
It would, but it would be not as fun, not as like inviting.
Sure. Yeah. But it would. But that's what makes them great books. That's why it's not just, hey, here's this thing. I think every fiction is that way, right? You tell it in a certain way to be able to exaggerate certain things so people understand it.
Your audience.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. This is fun.
All right. So I think I've got the last one here. Hunger Games.
What?
Is Hunger Games fantasy?
Dystopian. So we
Sure.
haven't really talked much about dystopian.
Yep, and dystopian is interesting, and even science fiction is interesting.
Yes.
Because you operate in some of the same sphere. And in fact, there's lots of people that would argue fantasy sci-fi is one genre. Because I will admit the line is weird.
It is weird.
Right. But there are elements of this that I think may fall in fantasy. First, we talked about this a little bit before, but if you remove the fantastical things of this world, would the plot still hold up?
This one.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of what is fantastical. I can only think of dystopian.
Well, and I guess the question is dystopian fantasy?
Yeah. I
Right?
really do
So
think so.
do you think it fits under that, or is it just another subgenre of fiction in and of itself?
Definitely is a subgenre. That's why it's called dystopian, not fiction. Not fantasy.
So I could get behind the idea of dystopian is its own thing.
Yeah.
There's plenty of things that would follow this Maze Runner, Ready Player One, a bunch of others where there's no magic. In fact, I'm just defeating my own argument of maybe this being fantasy here, right? Because I think about it and be like, you could remove the setting and put this entirely somewhere else, and it would still be the same thing of people fighting in a cage match, basically, to be able to be elevated in society. I think it, I think dystopian may just be its own thing.
But I think it is not its own fiction thing. I think it's its own fantasy thing.
Oh, interesting. I think fantasy and dystopian are separate genres. Now think about it. In the same way that I think these books that we talked about here are probably more in that philosophical fiction.
Yes, I do.
Right. I think there may be 3 distinct genres there, and a distinct genre probably for sci-fi. It doesn't mean that things aren't sliding across all these things, but I do think that that's kind of, and same with romantasy, right? I think there's a lot of things that may move around here, but I do think that probably qualifies as dystopian as its own.
Well, what's interesting about dystopian is like the Jays, tracker jackers. Those are the bees. No, what are the jabber jays?
Yeah, whatever. I don't know, but tracker jackers is not a good thing in my head. I hate bees. No, thank you. Bees, no.
Anyway, the jabber jays. What are they called?
I don't know.
Anyway, but like, no, it's the ones where they're like.
Aren't they? They're robots.
Yeah, robot ones. Like, and they make you hear other people's voices. Like, that to me is fantasy, but it's also like sci-fi because that could just be like technology. Yeah. So this is interesting.
Yep. So I think dystopian probably fits its own realm because think about Ready Player One is another good example. Yeah. Right? Where that is technology that's advanced, right?
Yes.
So maybe you can argue it gets into sci-fi, but it definitely has this setting where if you remove the setting, it just doesn't hit as much, right? Like if you and actually now thinking about Hunger Games, maybe Hunger Games into that too. It's got a unique, maybe not setting. It's not like the world matters. It's like the state the world is in.
Yes.
Which is dystopian, actually. Now you think about it. Like that is what dystopian means, is you have this kind of post-apocalyptic kind of setting. Yeah. And that's really what's happening here.
Just funny. So like Project Hail Mary.
Okay. I think that's just straight sci-fi.
Just straight sci-fi. Okay. Yeah. But Ready Player One, you put more in the mix.
I would put more in dystopian.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yep. Right. I think there's
even though like there could very well be a time in our future, just technology, that we could do that.
Yes, totally. But it's I think the part where it's dystopian is we have this technology and it's led us into a bad place. Yeah. Right. I think almost every dystopian novel is that kind of warning of what is in the future. That could be bad. Where sci-fi doesn't necessarily go there. It's just it's fiction that's based around something science-y that's gonna go there, which is actually an interesting one. I'll leave one last thing.
Okay.
Is Star Wars sci-fi, or is it fantasy?
It feels more fantasy for sure.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now the setting, people feel like sci-fi is space and things like that, and yes, I think you could argue there. But the interesting thing is Star Wars is such an extent with space and with other things. I mean, it's literally got a magic system that really makes it feel like it is just fantasy in a sci-fi setting. Yep. As opposed to anything else. So I think that's the classic crossing both bridges here. Yes. And interestingly, you could tell the Star Wars story, the entire thing, and put it in a different setting, and it would still probably do rather well in that regard. Because it's really a swords and shields, Dungeons and Dragons style story, just happened to be set in space.
Right. Interesting. That's a good one.
Anyways,
this was nuts.
Yeah, it was. So I think we classified very few in fantasy, but we also grabbed ones we knew were going to be kind of controversial. Right. Obviously, if we had Lord of the Rings, we'd be like, great, fantasy. Right. But I'm curious how people at home answer. What do you think is fantasy? What would be dystopian, romantasy, any of those type of things? Fiction. Does something need to be categorized this way, or is this just a pointless argument? Probably.
I mean, most likely. Yeah. But it's still really fun, and just the more you think about it, like, oh, wait, where would this fit?
And the real question is, how should we organize our bookshelves?
Seriously, though, this is hard. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm Jamie.
I'm Blake.
And we're Blamie.
I guess so.
Bye.
Bye.